Okay. All right. So let me screen share. So the sort of framework for this particular session is to talk not only about kind of how do you get into doing freelance work in this space, but about what that actually is like as a creative process, and working with clients, setting your own parameters, how to do that well. So there are a couple of things that most of this session is not really that focused on, like how to build a portfolio, how to actually get jobs in the first place. There are a bunch of other resources for that, and I'm going to talk briefly about, kind of what those are at the end of the slide. But the main things that this talk is about are things more around kind of setting yourself up for success, understanding how this kind of work is different from other things that you might be doing. If you came out of either just kind of a hobbyist background or a background where you've been a student and you've been writing things for yourself, that is a different experience. It's also a very different experience to actually writing in a studio on a team where you're receiving kind of assignments and working with the rest of the group. So there's this kind of interesting space, like what kind of creative work is possible, what does it involve? And there's a huge variety of kinds of things that one might do in this arena. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit and sort of provide some grounding of what I've seen. My own background coming into this is that professionally at the moment, I'm creative director at Fail Better Games. We hire a lot of freelance writers to work with us on a regular basis. So I've seen that process from that side a fair amount. I've worked at past places where we've hired freelance writers to work with us. I've also been a freelance writer and narrative designer hired by various places as well. So I'm kind of bringing the experience of being on both sides of that divide to this conversation. At the same time, like there are a lot of things that I have not myself done. So I want to, and I know there are some people on this call, not only our panelists, but others who also have worked in spaces that I myself have not. So if people have sort of further thoughts that they want to throw in, that is very welcome. So just to kind of like get a sense for what is the space here that we're even talking about? And it's a much larger space than I think I realized when I initially got interested in doing freelance writing for games. So there are things that are very much kind of at the more hobby-like or the more sort of don't quit your day job end of the spectrum, where you might be doing things where you've got spare time projects and you have your own Patreon or you've got some crowdfunding, but perhaps you're putting things out there that are sort of light in terms of their commercial expectations, but you're still making something off of it. Or you could be doing things where you're creating content for a publishing platform, but the rights and the sort of responsibilities for that work predominantly remain with you. So there are a number of different contexts for people at this point to be writing interactive fiction for Choice of Games, for instance, or things that are designed to be published in sort of online magazine kinds of contexts, or on mobile apps and interactive fiction platforms like that. The monetization of that tends to vary quite widely, and there's kind of a large conversation to be had there. Some of those systems are designed to be quite supportive of the writer, but many of them are not. So Choice of Games puts quite a bit of work into giving the writer an advance, treating it more like a traditional sort of book-like publishing arrangement, supplying you with an editor, providing all of the marketing, all of that kind of thing. So that's quite a supportive context. There are a number of other places which will just invite you to contribute content to their platform, but basically you're on your own in the sea of content with everybody else. Just like if you made a game for Roblox or something, you might not ever see anything out of that, even though some people on those platforms are making quite a lot. Kind of a step up from that are things where you're doing writing or narrative design work for hire on a larger project led by a studio. And I mentioned work for hire here because one of the things that I've encountered a few times with people who are kind of new to working in this space is a certain amount of like basically surprise that work that they're doing, they rarely have any kind of IP ownership over or sort of long-term copyright control over. And it's really much more typical for writing in the game industry that you do not retain the rights. You're brought in, you're working on something for the studio, but they're not going to give you, kind of your own ownership of that. There are occasional exceptions, especially if you're talking about IP that you brought to the system in the first place. If you were, for instance, the writer of a novel that was particularly admired, and then you were brought in to work on a game that was based on that, then the IP perhaps would not transfer ownership there. But typically this is work for hire. And that means you're coming in, you're doing this work, it belongs to the studio, it's not yours. If if the game is canceled or if you leave the project, that's it. You don't have access to that anymore. And that is just kind of part of what this is like. Alongside that, there are sometimes situations where you're brought in to actually be kind of a headliner name on something, and people will actually want to say, hey, this is a piece of work that this person contributed to. And if you're thinking, well, like, oh, I'm not famous enough for that to happen to me, like, what is she talking about? This can happen at all kinds of different levels. So sometimes, even if you're, kind of just getting started, but you've got a name within a particular community, you might be brought in that context to create some bonus content for a Kickstarter project when it reaches stretch goals or things like that. You might be invited to contribute to something because your involvement with the project is going to help give it authenticity or visibility to somebody that the creator of the project really wants to reach. And the reason that I bring that up is that that's a situation where if you are being brought in that way, I definitely advise kind of giving a lot of thought to what you're agreeing to and how comfortable you are with having your name attached to something in that way. So I'll come back to this a little bit more later, but this is a kind of like, if you're putting your name on something and you're also at the same time trying to kind of build up your creative brand, that is something that's worth thinking about. It is also something worth thinking about. What should I be charging in this context? Is it perhaps different from what I would be charging under other circumstances? A completely different sort of set of things, but which I find, those first sort of four things are the things I guess I would say that I was kind of aware of from the outset, coming into the industry. Like, I knew that all of those things happened. I figured that was kind of the span of things that somebody might do freelancing in this space, but there's a bunch of other stuff as well. So another thing that you could be hired to do is come in and work with a project that perhaps has multiple other people involved with the narrative in some way, where you're actually running writers' rooms, you're briefing artists and giving them instructions about how to develop the environments that your game is going to happen in, building up the visual look of the space. You might be, if you're working on a game that is going to be recorded for voiceover, you might be actually invited to attend a studio or remotely kind of supervise a studio recording session and give directions to the voiceover artist. So that's a case where, and this is something that people who've kind of worked in really large game studios are more likely to come in already familiar with, that when you're doing voiceover for a game, you really need your voiceover artists to have some direction and some understanding of like, what is the context of this line, right? Like, I've got this line in a spreadsheet, it's got some tags on it that are going to be used to put it into the game, but like, what is going on around this? Because that's how they actually get at giving a good performance. So if you are kind of hired in as a freelance participant in that kind of project, you might very well be asked to do this kind of thing. Another thing that comes up sometimes is providing narrative design support for a writer or group of writers that are trained in other media. We're seeing more of this kind of work as interactive film and television is growing a bit. So some people may have heard of or worked with EKO, which I think is no longer doing as much of this anymore, but for some time was doing a lot of interactive storytelling that was using film and TV style transitions, but also things like kind of interactive cooking shows where you could decide what kind of recipe you wanted to see or things like that. There's still a lot of this happening with other producers. So, Netflix is getting into this space more extensively. And these are things where they often, if they're building something for audio or for filming or for TV, they often are wanting to work with people who have some experience in those media, because there are a lot of sort of specific requirements about writing that kind of output. Writing for film in particular really requires you to get the script to a certain point, because you're not going to be able to re-edit, as much as you might hope after it's been filmed. But the people who have experience in writing for those media possibly don't know very much, or possibly not really anything at all, about narrative design, about interactivity, communicating choices, how to build a narrative structure where there are interesting choices. So this kind of work sometimes can involve, sitting down with people who are building these things out and either doing a kind of a preliminary, okay, well, let's talk about your sort of overall plot concept, but how we might do that as an interactive plot and what kind of choices might be available to the player or the viewer. And sometimes you don't get into the project that early on, and you wind up in a situation where instead you're kind of reviewing something that somebody else has built, but you're giving feedback and helping them understand, what is interactivity going to do to this experience? Is this going to work? Is this covering all of the bases? So all of those kinds of things. Yet another thing in this space is leading workshops, doing talks, doing training sessions. So things where you might be coming into a studio where either they don't have many writers, or they have very junior writers, or they need to get the rest of their team to understand what is going on with the game narrative. So you might be talking to people who have a bit of experience with storytelling, or you might be talking to people who really have almost none, who are primarily coming to this from perhaps a systems game design perspective, or programming, or kind of other parts of the game dev universe. And in that context, the task is really kind of coming in and helping provide some tools, some vocabulary, some grounding, helping people understand, what are ways that we even talk about story in games? What are ways that we build structures that support those? You might be working with a group of programmers that need to engineer some tools and needed to kind of talk them through how that works. And then similarly, sometimes it's something where there is a writers group, but they really want somebody who's going to kind of help them specifically break down the story a little bit from a position of a bit more experience. And kind of depending what your own level of background is with this kind of work, you might be seen as a good person to kind of bring in and just help oversee the initial kickoff development of something. And then you might go away. That might be all that you do on a project, and you might leave and go do something else. A few more things, which again, we see the type on the page scrunching smaller and smaller as more things turn out to be in this space than one might have initially anticipated. Something that I've done a fair amount of and have also reached out to other people to work with is when there is some new piece of technology that somebody wants to develop. So this might be anything from sort of AR and VR experiences to different presentation modes, different kinds of things. Basically, somebody has a piece of tech and they are convinced that there is some cool narrative game thing that could be done with it, but they don't really quite know what. And so what they want to do at that point is bring in people who have imagination in this kind of space, a bit of experience with trying different things. And often they will want to bring in a bunch of different people and try a bunch of different things. And so kind of coming into that space is an interesting and really pretty different challenge, because you're not necessarily working with a pipeline or a tool set that you're already familiar with. You might be having to learn something quite novel. You might be having to work, sort of wrap your head around the challenges of a totally different presentation medium. But at the same time, there's this kind of opportunity to just break new ground in terms of, what kinds of experience could we even hypothetically be providing to somebody. And then at the really kind of high end in terms of either difficulty or required experience levels are things where somebody is hiring you, and this is typically not a game studio at this point, but somebody is hiring you to actually fully implement an entire small game for them for some reason. So that's something where that becomes a very different negotiation, because at that point you're saying, okay, well, what do you, the deliverable is now not, I have a piece that I'm going to give you towards your game. It's I'm turning in this entire game. So then you need to have the conversations around like, what other resources are you going to need to make that happen? What are the channels of delivery, all of this kind of thing. So that is a much more ambitious kind of project to do. But there are cases, I've wound up doing this multiple times, so it's not as far-fetched as it might seem, where somebody has something they want to do, perhaps they're coming from an education space, perhaps they're coming from a sort of advertising and marketing space, and they want to do something, but they themselves really don't have any game creation experience at all. And so they're reaching out to somebody to do something. And if somebody is coming to you as kind of an individual freelancer, rather than going to a larger company for this kind of work, then usually they're looking for something reasonably small scale, but that still makes it probably a big project from your perspective. And then on the sort of consulting and advisory end of the spectrum, there are things like actually sort of helping people get very, very new studios started up, or coming in and consulting on a new project for a big studio. So if you have particular expertise that somebody wants to kind of consult you about for a really large indie or AAA kind of game, that is something where you might go in and do a workshop with them or a feedback session of a couple of days. Those tend to be high effort and high reward projects. So you usually, if you're setting something like that up, spend a fair amount of time thinking about what are they hoping to get out of me by bringing me in here? How do we prep for this? And then what are they going to need after the session as well? So you probably are thinking in terms of like, what are my prep things? What am I doing when I'm on site with these people? And then what follow-up deliverables am I going to give them? And that's something where, the kind of range of billing and effort is much higher in that kind of space, because the expectations around what you're delivering and how you're doing it are also much higher. So this is a huge spectrum. I mean, we start at, things that you could be doing, kind of in your spare time, and moving to things where, somebody might be flying you a long distance to visit their studio for 3 days. And it kind of, what's involved in that can vary hugely. So, sort of the flip side to what is the work and what's possible in this space is sort of the question of who is hiring and why. So, again, like sort of starting at the small scale, like you've got individual creators who are building something cool that is beyond their personal ability to create fully. So they don't have a team or a studio yet. They want to reach out and work with somebody. So those tend to be like typically relatively less budget, but situations where you might wind up in a very collaborative relationship with those people, possibly even, kind of wind up deciding that, hey, we want to spin up something together. This is going to become more than just a freelancer client relationship. It's going to become something more of a partnership sometimes. Sometimes it's things where game studios need more content than they can create in-house, or they're missing specific expertise or specific voices, or they're working on a project in a space that they haven't worked on before, and so they want your really kind of specific input on that. And those are all like, those can all be fun in different ways. And a lot of what we do at Fail Better is bring people in to write individual chunks of content for a very long running game, where it's really helpful to us to not have our sort of core in-house writing team having to produce every one of these stories every month, because that is tiring for us. And it also kind of, means that we would have less diversity in the stories that we were telling and the voices that we had telling those stories. So reaching out to other people to do that is very helpful to us. We also do a number of things where we invite in consultants to talk to us for an afternoon about specific subject matter. And we tend to find that a really energizing, exciting thing. Like the entire writers team absolutely loves like having a consultant in for that. It's a lot of fun. And then the sort of last thing on this list, which is sort of the more perhaps difficult thing, is if sometimes you've got a game studio where a project that they're working on is running into a bit of trouble, basically, and they feel like their in-house team like doesn't quite know what to do about it. And so you're kind of brought in to like help fix that. And that tends to like, it can be an interesting task, but it also tends inevitably to be a more political task than a lot of these other things, because you're kind of coming into a situation where people have an investment, they have feelings, they have ideas, and you're a total stranger, you don't know the lay of the land, and you're trying to deal with that. So that's a thing to kind of be aware of. Like if somebody invites you in that context, to kind of think about like, how is that going to work out? And then, as I indicated, like not all hirers of game writers are game studios. So there are entertainment companies interested in interactivity. I talked a little bit about that earlier. There are tech developers who want to explore possibilities around their tech. So I mentioned AR and VR, chatbots are one. This is a kind of thing that tends to go in waves, and it tends to follow. Basically what happens is the tech investment community gets excited about a particular piece of technology. A lot of investment money flows into that space. Suddenly there are a lot of startups, a lot of groups looking at what can we do with this. They perhaps see a game application, and so they reach out to a bunch of game writers to try and contextualize and come up with good uses for the technology that they're currently working on. Right now, a lot of that has to do with like things based in cryptocurrencies and NFTs, which from my point of view is not particularly delightful, because I do not want to work on things with the environmental footprint that those have. And so, you kind of need to think about like, is this something that I really want to connect with? But it's also something where like what is currently interesting in this space moves. It moves pretty rapidly. It's, I would say, in 2 or 3 years, like there will be a different set of things, or possibly even sooner than that, that people are really interested in kind of investing in and exploring. And then, as I was saying, also companies that are looking to use games for some other purpose entirely, like education, advertising, serious game projects. And that also can be a very interesting and often, sort of a different set of challenges arises around that, because anything that is designed for children has a different set of sort of regulatory implications and game design implications. Anything where you're working for an advertising agency, you have multiple companies that actually like strongly care about what you're doing. And so both of those situations kind of are bringing in new things to think about there. Another thing I see happening is people running contests where it's like, hey, submit your content and some of you will, whoever wins this contest will give you some amount of money. I'm not going to like tell people to never enter these, and sometimes they can go okay for people, and sometimes people have been discovered by them, but I tend to treat them with a fair amount of caution, because I think often they are not really offering the people who are contributing to them an amount of support and remuneration that would be appropriate for the amount of effort that is being put in. So take that kind of stuff with a grain of salt, I think. So those are kind of, things that you could be doing, places that you could be working for. I'm not going to talk very much about finding work and building a portfolio, but just kind of at the very high level, I think, it's what I found particularly useful is really building a connection with other freelance game writers and designers. So just being here in this space and talking to other people that you meet here or on Twitter or in these kinds of groups is hugely useful. Many of the jobs that I've gotten because I knew other game writers. And often for things, especially for things that are pretty small projects, things are often not advertised anywhere. They're very often distributed in a word of mouth way. That's not ideal in all cases for understandable reasons, but nonetheless, that is the landscape. And so, kind of getting to know people and sort of, making people aware that you're out there and you're looking at this space is quite useful. And then the sort of final, sort of packet of advice that I always give is, as you're looking at all of these things and working out what am I doing with this, it's extremely useful to understand both yourself and your client as much as you can when you're going into the process. So understanding yourself is about like, what is my skill set? What am I good at? What projects have I done well or poorly? Just kind of taking a bit of an inventory of this for yourself. It equips you to make your portfolio show off your best work. It puts you in a better position to talk about your strengths in a call. It helps you figure out what kinds of things you would want to work on next. And that's all sort of stuff that you could just kind of sit down and think about this yourself and kind of get to a point where you understand all of these things. And one of the things we're going to be talking about in the panel is, sort of people talking about like what has worked well for them and what they prefer to do. Understanding your own limits is the flip side of that. And I mean, partly, you're sort of, what are you not good at? And everybody has some of those things. But also, perhaps even more than that, like, where would you draw the line? Like, if a client is asking you to do a certain kind of project, what would make you say no to that? Why would you do that? What would make you consider leaving mid-project? And the more that you understand about that, the better you're positioned at the beginning of a project to say to somebody, this is what I'm willing to work on. This is what I'm not willing to work on. If you're going to be doing this kind of thing, you need a different person to work with. And that, I mean, that's come up for me with some of these conversations about like NFT-based games. And like, that is not a thing that I am excited to do. I have strong reasons why not. There are a couple of, sort of situations in which I could imagine, finding that the situation was actually okay. But for the most part, like, it's hard for me to see how that could work. So that's one of my sort of, the lines that I would draw. But there are others. There are some projects where I've started out not entirely sure about how the client was planning to portray women in their game, and have said up front, I am not on board to work on a project that is going to be really objectifying your female NPCs. So if that is something that you anticipate doing this game, again, please work with someone else. But the more that you know about that and can articulate it up front, the easier it is to avoid some really unpleasant situations later. And what are you excited about? What makes a project a hell yes project for you? What do you want to learn? What do you want to work with? Who do you want to work with? All of those kinds of things are useful to know. And then sort of looking at the client side of a project, what does success look like from the client's perspective? Is it something you think you can help with? Do you share their goals? Do you understand their goals? So this is the kind of stuff where when I'm working with a new client, I usually have one or several setup meetings where we discuss, what is their project? What are they trying to do? Why? What does success look like for them? And I'm kind of processing, are these realistic expectations? Are they things that I think I can help them with? Who all is even involved in this? Who are the stakeholders in this that are going to have opinions about whether it's working or not working, or be giving me feedback? And what are they most concerned about? And how am I going to be communicating with all of those people? So I mentioned earlier, one of the interesting challenges about working in kind of advertising spaces is that you have both the advertising agency that you're working for and their client. And sometimes you wind up talking to both of those groups, and sometimes they don't actually think they want the same thing. And that makes things extra challenging. But the more that you can kind of map out that landscape in advance, the beginning of the project, the easier it gets. Another big question is, how experienced is the client at being a client? Have they done a project like this before? Have they hired writers and narrative designers before? Do they know what that looks like? Are they used to it? Is this entirely new? Are you basically coming in and educating them about how to work with you? And that's something that is also helpful to be conscious of and think about, like, how are we going to negotiate this? Is it going to work the way that I'm expecting? Do they have other expectations? If you're working with somebody who is a client that is based in another creative medium, they often will have a completely different set of expectations about how the writing process works, and they may not know, like, you may not realize that you should have that conversation, because you may each think like, oh, I know how this works, but you're coming from different spaces, and so you have actually quite different expectations. So in particular, like, if you are working with somebody who's coming out of radio or television or film, those all have very different ways of writing, duration of writing, editing, drafting, writers' rooms. All of those things tend to work differently than they do in the games industry. And therefore, like, having an explicit conversation early on about what are you expecting to see, how long is this going to take, who's going to have input, are you expecting to see a first draft and give notes, are you expecting to see a finished product? All of those things are important to kind of talk through and establish. And does the client have the resources to do what they want to do? And this is not just like, can they pay me the amount of money that I want to make, but also, like, do they have enough to like do their QA properly? Do they have enough for editing? To some extent, that's, like, it's partly up to them and their understanding, but the better you can sort of grasp all of that space, the easier it is to communicate like what you're going to need out of the interaction. in a way that works for everybody. And why did this client come to you specifically? What is their reason for that? And that's also an interesting thing to understand in advance. Okay, so I have already talked slightly too long, but a couple of sort of last slides, which I will just basically leave in the video and let people ask about if they have questions. There are a few handful of things that I find useful to have that are maybe not sort of super obvious things that you would know that you would need for game writing, but that I get a lot of use out of. Storyboarding tools, time tracking tools. Harvest is a tool that lets me track my time and auto-generate invoices. The amount of time that has saved me is amazing. Like, I hate invoicing. Having a thing that gives me a button to press to churn out an invoice is a brilliant thing. And then I'm going to pause on this slide because it's got some links for things around, like, if you do want to know about the things that we're mostly not getting into this evening, there are places to look. Okay, so I have just monologued a lot, I know. Are there questions that people would like to ask at this point? I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I'll ask a different question. Are there things that people were sort of expecting to talk about or think about that were not covered anywhere in that overview, like other forms of game writing or work experience that you were thinking of that I didn't include? Nope. Okay. Cool. So I will stop screen sharing now. Oh, Rasmus.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so actually I was just wondering, it's a minor thing, but I think you covered up a lot of ground, but I've also looked into chatbots and talked about, I mean, personalities and stuff. Obviously,
yeah.
they're still very primitive, so probably there's a long way to go, but it could also, I guess, be assignments, at least in the future, that you kind of build up personalities and narratives associated with that.
Yeah. So that's something that I sort of swept into the larger category of sort of tech and similar spaces. And there's a big range of applications for that, some of which are very much in the storytelling and narrative space, but a lot of them are somewhere in the middle and are looking at, could we create a personality for customer service? Can we create a personality for kind of a concierge for different situations? Like the idea of, what if I had a character at my theme park or at my hotel or at my event that guests can come up and talk to and ask questions of? And that is actually an enormous kind of industry space. It does have a lot of sort of technical skills tied into it that are slightly different from what you might expect in games, but not completely different. So that's another kind of interesting space. Cool. There's a question about stories and lessons learned. Well, I think for that, let's let the panel talk about theirs. And then if there are more questions from me about that, I can answer some more things on that. Do you have any advice about how to gain the information you need to navigate this field, other than attend to meetings like this and get hired and pay attention? So there are a couple of different things to think about. So one of the things is around sort of professional expectations. How do you set rates? How do you look at contracts? How do you sort of just deal with a lot of the individual bits of that? And on that, some of the links on this slide are useful. Writers Guild of Great Britain provides some guidance about what sort of appropriate fees are for different tasks. Those fees are obviously, they're coming from a worker representing organization, and they also are tied in a bit to sort of the higher paid end of the spectrum, but they're still quite useful to look at and think about in terms of, okay, well, you know, how would my day rate like probably scale relative to this? So there are a bunch of things like that where there are in fact resources out there. They, you know, sometimes people don't know where to find them, but they exist. And then there are Writers Guild meetups. There are special interest groups associated with the IGVA and that sort of thing. Yes, as Ian points out, if you're a member of the Writers Guild, they will also review contracts for you, which is very helpful. So if you basically need somebody to look at stuff and tell you, like, is this even a reasonable thing for people to be asking of me? That's quite helpful. I've had some really, really extraordinary things put into contracts that people were asking of me, including one contract that was drawn up that asked me to not fly in any small planes for the duration of the time that I was working on the project. That was an unexpected thing, but I wasn't planning to fly in any small planes, so it wasn't really a problem. Otherwise, in terms of, you know, the kind of the other information that you might need, I also recommend, you know, there's sort of like training yourself in the skills. So looking at, you know, blog posts, talks that people give about projects they've worked on, and just like understanding how do you build things in this space and write for this space. And then there's also just scheduling. Like, I think like possibly the most astonishing skill in my view that, you know, to work out is how do I deal with having multiple clients in an industry where no schedule ever goes entirely to plan. And so, you know, that's its own sort of special thing. And I don't have any advice about how to learn that other than the hard way, honestly. So that's, yeah, that's just a thing that you kind of struggle with a bit and then get a feel for. Okay, so let me turn this off and invite our panelists to make themselves visible.
Can I start that? Yep, there we go.
Yay. Okay, so I wanted to start by having each of us introduce ourselves, well, not myself, but each of you introduce yourselves and say a bit about what you do and how you got started. So Allie, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Allie Bustion. I'm a freelance game designer, mostly in tabletop. I've worked on like a Pathfinder 2A Kickstarter projects like Thirsty Sword Lesbians. And I started designing games because especially in tabletop, I realized how many things I was home rolling in to make up for things that I might do as a GM. Say like, okay, I don't like how this is written, but if I do it this way, I'll like it more, until eventually I somehow got hired to work on games. I'm not sure when or how. Really, just like I made stuff, I put it on the internet and people liked it enough to pay me money.
Excellent. George?
Hello, I'm George Lockett, and I am a writer and narrative designer working primarily in like video games and the few adjacent formats. I work both on my own and with my partner Olivia Wood as part of Beowulf Narrative, primarily doing consultation stuff with mostly indies, that we kind of work across the range. I kind of got started, it's not been that many years now. I think I kind of was working on freelance work from about 2017, 2018 while doing another job in tech marketing. And I think that the two things that kind of factored most directly into me moving into games was, I mean, firstly, just I was a fiction writer already. I wrote prose fiction, which was helpful in some ways, but misses a lot of the pieces. But also, I've been running tabletop role playing games since I was 10, and it turns out if you do that for a long time, even very informally, it's useful to suddenly. It was very gratifying to find that was actually a useful skill that I had been cultivating all this time that I can get paid money for. Yeah, that's kind of my intro.
Cool. Hello.
Hi, I'm Florencia Minuzzi. I'm the writing half of T-Proud Games, which is a two-person studio with my partner Dustina. And we mostly focus on making narrative video games, especially ones where the narrative and mechanics work well together. And I also as Allie mentioned, I like making games that I haven't seen yet, putting things in there that I don't get to play in games myself. And that leads to a lot of games like games centered on interesting conversation mechanics, which is something I want to see more of overall. And I also do freelance writing, narrative design, and a little bit of UI design, which is a bit different, but it all kind of works together quite well. And I made my studio while I was also working on something else full time. In my case, it was scientific research. And I was at a junction trying to figure out, should I continue with research or should I go into games, the thing I have been quite enjoying a lot more. And I decided to go for that. And that was 8 years ago
now. So starting on sort of a high note, from your freelance work so far, what's an example that you're particularly proud of?
Everyone's waiting very cautiously, cautious to speak. I'm happy to go if no one else wants to go first. Just to, no, okay. I mean, well, the annoying thing is most of the stuff is still unreleased or under NDA. But one thing that kind of speaks to some of the stuff that you were talking about before, Emily, it was we worked on BBC Earth Micro Kingdom Sensors, which is a bit of a mouthful of a title, which was it was BBC Interactive working with Preloaded to develop an AR experience for the Magic Leap, which I think was kind of part of a sort of proving that what that kind of tech could do. And it's kind of a really neat, like a natural history AR thing where you can sort of get up close with the leafcutter ants and the Brazilian wandering spider. And that was kind of a really good project where we got to come in and do cool things. We were working with like a natural history producer. They kind of had a lot of the stuff, like it was midway through a project and they had a lot of sort of traditional script stuff down, but they needed specifically interactive support to make this sort of make sense and do bring a lot of the games thinking to this kind of experience. So that was a lot of fun to get to actually like mess with this cool experience and like write some dialogue lines for Stephen Fry and like generally feel like someone working on a natural history project. That was cool.
Writing things that would be read by Stephen Fry is just like inherently a win.
It made it so much easier because you could just hear. I mean, I think that's true anytime when you know the specific voice actor who they're going to be, like writing in their voice already makes life a lot easier. But like that one, you just know the voice. Like it's just it's in my head all the time. I can yeah, really work with that.
I can go next, I guess. So I worked for a while on a text-heavy sci-fi game that was taking place across various different space stations, and I actually got to write one of those space stations. And because it was a very text-heavy game, you could kind of build up the station any way you wanted. You could write the description and make it happen. Because you didn't need that many graphics, you could make it the way you wanted. And I used that in part just to kind of make it come to life in interesting ways that didn't require high budget. But it also gave me a lot of freedom to kind of use the station itself to interrogate the in-game assumptions that were already there that I came to kind of because the project was already started. So I could use in-game events to interrogate ideas about like characters being inherently better at certain skills because of their genotypes, or like who gets access to cloning and body modification, some of which are kind of mechanics in the game. And I could bring that into my station and just kind of point at some of these things and make people think about them. And I thought that was very nice that I could do that and it let me do it, and just made the world kind of richer for having that other point of view.
That sounds really cool.
I haven't designed anything that would be terrible. Well, I guess tabletop is inherently interactive, but writing the world guide for the Mwangi Expanse for Pathfinder 2e just in sheer word count that when I signed up for things at the time, didn't realize it would be that high, and it ended up being more than a novel worth of lore that I made for Pathfinder. And the devs at Paizo letting me do some of the most self-indulgent things that I've had at that point done in writing. And I did more self-indulgent things later, but like just being able to make that much and do that much and be that self-indulgent. And they were like, yeah, this is great, this is good. And then seeing people afterwards being like, this is the most amazing thing. I never expected to see this in any tabletop game, let alone Pathfinder. Like, and injecting a lot of inherent Black joy into Pathfinder, especially like in the current political environment. It was nice. It was incredibly self-indulgent and people also liked it.
It's always amazing when you are able to like express yourself authentically and people react well. That's amazing. It's fantastic. Cool. Are there times when working on a client project has let you achieve something that you would never have done on a solo project, or that you just wouldn't have been able to get done in that context?
I feel like it's been most of them, just because there's the kind of stuff that I don't have the capacity. I'm a writer and a narrative designer. I can do a little bit of programming, like I can make things in ink and that kind of thing, but there's a hard limit on getting to do anything more. I think whenever there's like anything like with cool art or sound design, all those kind of things, I'm just in awe at all that stuff being there, and to have that like wrapped up in something that I'm doing and to be able to have some input into that is brilliant.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And sometimes you put something in and you interact with people about it, but then when you go and say play it yourself and you see what other people have done around your work and with it, it's always kind of breathtaking to jump into this world and be like, oh yeah, this has been created now. And I also
I was gonna say I get to see a lot less of that unless someone finds me like on Twitter, or like I'm on a podcast that's on Twitch and I look at the chat and I happen to see the message that's like, oh yeah, I got to do this with like the character option that you made, or because of this, I like looked at the world in a different way. So it's a lot smaller getting to like see things that I've done that people like interact with later.
And are you working in anticipation of those moments? Like, does that feed, like getting access to those things when it happens, does that change how you work, or is it different?
No, I mostly do things that I want to do. I just don't always say that I'm doing the thing that I want to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me with any kind of client projects was like, when I'm working on my own personal stuff, like I just second guess myself constantly and just have like, there's so few parameters that it's good when it works, but there's that like there's a lot more stress and anxiety about doing what I think is right and interesting or not. Whereas if I'm working to spec, at least I like have a clear and present audience I'm trying to do something for, which is good and bad, because if it's good because you get the immediate feedback loop from someone who you're trying to deliver stuff to, and they can sort of, you're working towards a vision. But I sometimes get concerned about delivering on that more than, and potentially losing sight of the audience beyond that and what's coming at the other end of the process, and trying to figure out when to fight for things that need it in sort of defiance of what this immediate client wants, which there's probably not a good balance for that at all, but it's nice in one sense, but potentially limiting in another.
One of the other things that I personally find really interesting in this space, I mean, aside from just kind of having access to way more resources than obviously than I would have, is the cases where a client has invited me to work on a project where thematically there were things about that project that I found a really interesting provocation, even though they weren't necessarily things that I would have thought of writing about or addressing myself, but I found that I did actually have stuff to say about them. And I don't know whether that's like just me or a thing that other people run into as well.
Yeah, definitely as well. Even just going to a different genre that I don't normally go to or I'm not as drawn to, and then just seeing the things they bring to the table and you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about this thing in this way. That has sparked some ideas and you can take it somewhere interesting.
Yeah, and sometimes, you're working with a set of mechanics also, or a different player base, and that also kind of, gives your work a different shape. So when you're starting up a new project, what do you think is most important to establish with the client, and what early conversations set things up best for later? This actually like ties into something that somebody has just asked in the chat, but was in fact the question that we plan to talk about anyway. So yeah, getting started. How do you start with a new client? What do you do to agree?
For me, when it's not something where I'm getting a contract or I already know more or less what's expected of me, I do a lot of like asking, okay, so what do you actually want to see in the end? What kind of thing are you trying to get to? And then how are you trying to get there? Like for consulting that I was recently asked about, someone wants to make something they can present to a publisher. I have never had to pitch anything to a publisher before. I'm just good at like writing and designing. So I said, what you're probably looking for is not me. You might want to talk to someone that like does more editing and knows how to edit, or someone that is a publisher, and work with them to figure out exactly what you want so you can get to the actual end product that you want to present. Otherwise, you're just wasting a bunch of time and money for at least 2 and probably more people.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
no,
tracks.
I agree with that. And also in terms of where they are and when they want to get, I also find that sometimes the people you're working with have a very clear idea of exactly how they want something to be, and they just want to make words for that. And then other times they have a vague idea and they're really happy if you take the idea and make it yours and make it interesting. But you need to know which one it is, because you don't want to go off in one direction. And then they're like, no, but I told you what to do, or vice versa. You're kind of trying to do what they want you to do, but they want you to take it somewhere different.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Like the assumption clash is the thing I fear with like trying to just dance around each other until you figure out the relationship. I think for me as well, there's an element of like how you communicate, like more generally. And there's particularly some projects. I think particularly if I'm being like paid for time rather than on deliverables, I find it hard to justify. I feel like I have to justify like research and all the sitting with ideas time that actually is super important to any big project. And like if I was just doing something myself, I would spend a lot of time doing that, and that's good and normal. But I find that I have that I mostly self-imposed pressure to do generative work early, which I think is good in terms of getting something in front of the client and using that as a calibration tool. But if you're sort of zipping past that because you're trying to sort of justify your time in that kind of way, it can be good to establish that early and kind of, as Em said before, about making sure you're on the same page with regards to the process and what the key steps are, which helps everybody. I think a big one for me as well, just to add, sorry, throwing more things, is like I find estimation really difficult, particularly in games where every project I've done has been so wildly different, where I keep thinking like, now I've done that project, I can use the data from this to try and make a good assessment of how long this will take. And then you look at someone else's work and you go, this could take days or hours or some combination of the two. So like finding ways to have those kind of conversations. And I think some successes we've had has been when we've had just no idea, where they've had a very deliverable based model where they need certain numbers of things. That's very like broken down into specific deliverables, but we've not really been able to gauge how complicated it is to design with their mechanics. We've managed to, in some cases, get them to like, hey, let's do like 2 or 3 days of work and we'll try and produce something that you can use, but also like not guarantee that we'll be able to work to this, like trying, digging into the work enough on a paid basis to form a good estimation and then see if that fits with them, which doesn't always work out, right? It might not mesh with their budget and timeline, but it has been useful trying to like be explicit about that, because it can be a bit sort of brinksmanshipy, trying to like not undersell yourself and commit to tons of work for not enough money, but also not hit them with a big sticker shock where you're costing too much for their budget.
Yeah. No, avoiding situations where you have agreed a set project fee for a deliverable and then it turns out to take 3 times as much work as you thought, like that is a very, very important thing. So yeah. Conversely, what's the best thing that a client's done for you in terms of setting you up to do good work or helping you end up with something you were proud of?
I feel like I don't want to keep jumping in if people want to say things, but yeah, I think like fitting with some of the stuff before that Flo was saying about clients being responsive and flexible, particularly like if they know what they want, where they want to get to, but they know how flexible they can be on the route, that's way better, because rarely can one person like do exactly the steps that they might be envisioning. So someone who can like meet you kind of creatively in that way and give you some freedom, but also like has a clear idea of what they want, that usually goes well.
I also find that when you bring your point of view to kind of any game project, and this applies not just to writers, but anyone working on a collaborative thing together, if they kind of genuinely listen to what you're saying, even if they can't take everything you say on board. That doesn't mean you suggest something and they put it in, but if it feels like they're listening and they're trying to understand, that usually has ended up leading to better projects, because I can tell that when I bring something up, they care about it and they pay attention. So that's always kind of been a good sign that the collaboration is going to be good.
For me, it's giving me hard deadlines, like a midpoint and an endpoint deadline. So then I can go and plan everything else that I need to do in between. And then like 2 forms of relatively casual context, so like an email and a Discord or a Slack or something. So that way I can feel like I can ask questions, even if I never ask them directly outside of those like 2 hard deadlines. But I feel like I can ask them. And that ends up making me feel so much more comfortable and like I am actually collaborating than almost anything else.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I find like projects where I haven't had even like rough estimations of deadlines, or they've been really like flexible is good sometimes, but like it's definitely ones where I haven't had that. I find it hard to plan multiple projects because I'm just generally moving towards what is most urgent, and like working backwards from a deadline is so nice sometimes.
And also, speaking of like the ways you communicate, I also find it useful to, I need a certain amount of uninterrupted time if I'm working. So we'll say, okay, 9 to 5, I'm generally on and reachable, but I can't just be picking back and forth and having this conversation about small details. I need to check it when I'm done with the task, and then check the message and then go back to my task, because it's really hard to focus on just straight up designing or writing if you kind of have to ping back and forth.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
Somebody had a question in the chat that kind of ties into the communication style thing, which is, what are the signs that a do it my way client thinks that they are actually a do it your way client, or vice versa? So basically, like, how do you detect when the client is incorrect about their own desires, I think is the question here.
I think it just comes down to this, in my experience, you have to give them 1 or 2 things and then you see their reaction, because if they think that they're one and they're the other, you'll give them something, I'll just say, but remember that we said this other thing. Okay, very close to what you said then. I'll adjust to what you have said, but I can't tell beforehand until we've kind of had a little bit of back and forth.
I have had experience with a particularly large company where they asked for just like something in general, something that would be interesting for players. And then each thing that I turned and I was like, no, that's too close to this other product we have. That's too close to this other thing. Actually, just write this. And that was like, oh, I see. You weren't giving suggestions. You actually wanted this last thing the entire time. And we're just waiting for someone to write it for you.
That's
Got
really
it.
frustrating. Yeah, if I were better at spotting what made that would make life a lot easier. But I think yeah, like Flo said, it can be. Sometimes it's like, you know, you hit your head against the wall enough times trying to like push back in principle, and like, you know, having the meetings, having the discussions, whatever, trying to like point to what you think is right based on your own domain expertise. But sometimes it's a case of like having to do the thing as quickly and as smallly as possible to actually like demonstrate that, and then sort of moving past it. But I guess it depends on the kind of relationship. If it's a long-term relationship, it can be worth doing this, and that's not necessarily a sign of like pain forever, because you can build that trust with someone. But if it's going to be, particularly if it's going to be short, is it worth it if you're going to keep hitting that wall? Or you just have to, you know, acknowledge that they have a different idea of what your role is than you did at the beginning, which comes back to what we were saying before about figuring out what they want you to do for them, and being explicit about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that I would tie in here myself is like the question that I asked at the beginning around like how experienced is the client at being a client, and sometimes like the sort of communications issues in my experience, like they don't always come with clients not having worked with very many people before. It sounds like in Allie's case, like that client maybe could have known better, but that often is, you know, sort of like if they don't have a lot of experience with something, then that's going to affect what their experience, their sort of expectations are, and their ability to sort of self-judge and represent themselves. If they do have a lot of experience with it, then, if you find that it's hard getting calibration on that, then sometimes it's useful to just ask them about like, oh, do you have examples of previous work that you thought was good? To look at somebody else's contributions if they're willing to share that, or, how have your past work with other game writers gone? How have those been structured? Like what worked particularly well for you? And just like let them talk about what they thought was a good or bad experience. That can also be very helpful, even if you don't wind up kind of exactly copying what happened the last time. Those stories are sometimes helpful. There's a chat question, which I suspect will also get really varied answers, but I'm curious now. What would you consider the typical time frame for small, medium, and larger projects in terms of hours?
I think hours is one end of the scale, and then like months is the other end of the scale. I've had kind of projects which were just come in for 2 days, fix this one thing or work on this one thing. That's all we have the budget for, done. And then I have had, you will write for us a couple of days a week for months. And so it varies a lot.
Yeah, that matches my, I have at least one repeat client who has like 2 or 3 days of work every 2 or 3 months, which is excellent. I tried, like, at the moment, just in terms of like how I split my time, I try to do like a day as my minimum unit of time, just because that makes life a lot more flexible. And that relies on finding clients who want to do that, but still. Yeah, there's one project I've been working on for a year and a bit, but that's similarly being like a few days a month, like very spaced out. And one now is more like as much time as I can put into it, which is 3 or 4 days a week at this point. So it can really, really stretch from like teeny tiny to lots.
Tabletop gets very, very weird because you're more likely to be working on more projects and bouncing around between more things. But usually it's, am I writing something that someone will play in a session or two? Or am I writing some part of a big sprawling adventure or like part of the lore? And that will take months usually. Probably not quite as long as like video game writing, because I don't have to do my own testing if I'm working on something that big and sprawling. And if it's small, it's probably something that I can understand, maybe make 1 or 2 mechanics for, and then work around those 2 things. And that might take me like a week of a few hours a day.
Yeah, I like building up a balance as well. Like I think I'm at my best when I'm bouncing between like 2 or 3 projects. I've been in situations where it's been more than that, and that is bad. That is not good for me anyway. But if I'm just on one thing all the time, I find it's too easy for me to just. I mean, they're not quite in a rut. It takes a while to properly get into a rut, but I like being able to have like projects with slightly different. Like I'm doing, more heavily design on one thing, more heavily writing on one thing. Like different levels of complexity and difficulty are quite nice for giving your brain a break while still doing the work. So yeah, it's just hard to do that as a freelancer when you don't end up with way too much or way too little.
Yeah. I mean, so on my side, like I have had things where like the very smallest end has been, could you please look at this document for 2 hours and give us really targeted feedback, but it's in an area where you have expertise and therefore like that's important to us. And I charge a hefty hourly rate for that. All the way up to, we would like you to be basically a full-time contractor for the foreseeable future. Like both of those things are possible. Most things land somewhere in the middle, but there's really not sort of an easy upper and lower band for those. So I would say for things where there's sort of a consultation or workshop, that is, if I'm doing something on site, usually that's between 1 and 3 days, but that is like the 1 to 3 days that I'm on site is not the full extent of the amount of time that I put in, because there's also prep time, there's also a deliverable afterwards. So that kind of balloons that out as well. Somebody asked, can we share strategies for maintaining or holding on to your energy at the end of the day for your own side projects? Sorry, my laugh may have given something away there.
I mean, we were talking about having different projects and shifting between them, and I find that the amount of energy I have for my own projects depends a lot on that. If I'm working on one main freelance project, then I might have plenty of brain space for my own work. If I've got one project Monday, Tuesday, one project Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, that my head is too busy doing that, and then stopping doing that to rest after work time, and it can't do more. So a lot of it for me just depends on my situation overall.
Yeah, so I got when I started writing, it was alongside having a completely unrelated day job, and I got very good at making myself cram it into the time I had. And I've very much lost that habit now, partly because I'm doing it in the day. But I think, like I said before, I try and do things on the unit of the day. That's partly just because I find it very hard to like split in moment to moment between projects, not just because it's structurally more useful for me. So I find it, I'm trying to be better about it, because I'm not right now, but trying to like find the actual like time to essentially budget days to work on those kind of projects. But that mostly has left me with a long string of like unfinished personal projects that are sort of sitting there staring at me, making sad eyes.
As an answer, I'm going to tell an anecdote instead. I wrote a small story game for Unfettered Hexes that was based on a tarot mechanic I had put into like 2 other games. I do not remember how to play that game on any level without looking directly at it. And during the launch party, when I was asked, hey, would you want to like run this game for us? Maybe we can like record it. I had to say, I don't know how to play my own game anymore. So that's how much time I have to work on my own projects.
Yeah.
That's reminding me of the one thing I do. Sorry, go on.
No, please.
No, it's the one way I do make myself right is quickly. If I have an idea, I can just like immediately jump on it and do it, because I happen to have the energy and time, which is rare, and it's done. And then I'm like, it's not creating another unfinished thing, and then I'm sort of like, okay, I can be happy with that, but that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. I mean, for me, a lot of it is about just what is the side project, right? Like if I'm trying to have energy for something that is a side project, then that project needs to be distinctly different in kind from the things that I'm doing for work, because I have different types of energy, and if work is taking all of my design energy or all of my character writing energy, then I'm just out. And so my side project is not getting that. And, at that time, like maybe it would be better to have a different kind of side project. So there's a lot of, I've done sort of different types of things at times when I was heavily into game writing or code-based things. Like if I'm doing a lot of coding, like that is a time when my side project might be, character fiction. If I'm doing a lot of design work, that might be a good time for that stuff. So there's that side of it as well.
Sort of one more thing as well, which is collaborate with someone is a good way, because we entered a game to IF Comp this year, and that was partly because I started working on something with a friend just because it was fun, and that we actually made regular progress on it because we were like holding each other just accountable enough without being annoying and doing it. But we sort of would have like regular chats and bounce ideas off each other, and therefore get each other excited to actually work on things and come back and show each other the things we'd written. So that was a good like forcing function for making something happen.
Yeah. I mean, that is like a brilliantly chosen segue into my next question. So
Right.
well done. which is if you've been on a project where you were collaborating with the client rather than just delivering deliverables, what contributed to making that collaboration work?
For me, it was working on Kindled Magic for the Strength of Thousands adventure path. My co-writer was actually one of the devs on the project. They wrote chapter 1, I wrote chapters 2 and 3, and did a bunch of like map building, made some mechanics, and a lot of the tone for the setting, how the adventure was supposed to go, that we were setting, because it was the first part of a 6-part really long running campaign that's supposed to go from like a college age to teaching professor kind of age. A lot of that was set by that first chapter. I continued it, and then I injected a bunch of really self-indulgent things, but that were within the context. Like I got to introduce a wrestling style tournament with Leshy's piloting mechs as your opponents that act like luchadors. So I got to put a bunch of that personality in it and like put in some of the funness of going to college and doing things away from home for the first time, maybe. But still within, like, you're in an adventure, you're like learning how to do magic. Everything is going to somehow relate to magic in some way. And then eventually you'll get serious, but that wasn't as much fun. But just like having that tone set beforehand really helps say, like, this is something I can do. This is something I can push to do. And then this is something that probably won't work, but I can ask if it might.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to working with someone, I have found, especially when you're starting out, it's really useful to do really quick iterations. And I particularly love making diagrams. So you'll have an idea, you have something, you give it to them, and then they can look at it and very quickly be like, oh yes, this direction, or oh, I was thinking the other direction. And just the more you can iterate really quickly before you, especially if you can do that before you start writing or putting anything down, that kind of really helps to make sure that you're both on the same page if you're both going to work on something.
That's a really good point. Yeah, similarly, I had a galaxy brain moment earlier this year. I have a really bad, what I thought was a bad habit of like doing my thinking on the page and like writing long. I try and just like write a summary of stuff we discussed or some like design problem, and it would turn into like a 2-page like thing. And I just started calling them discussion documents. And now it looks like I intend to do that. But that's often the way I figure out problems and have to present it back to the client and gives them a way of like engage. It's a good sort of fodder for doing that. But then being able to do that lots of times without actually doing the harder writing or the more committed writing stuff. Yeah. I like working with people who are either like quite close to the writing or design side that they know enough to bounce off pretty well from that, or they're sort of immersed in some other discipline that they sort of bring something else to it. So like you're sort of working in some kind of like harmony there, and also just like being plugged into other parts of production. Like it can be a downside in smaller freelance gigs if you expect it to be on stand-ups and on Slack all the time, that kind of thing. If it's a small part of your time, it's a bad thing to commit to. But also like I've been on projects where I've been kind of siloed off just because contractor coming in to do something. And generally the middle ground is better, particularly for longer term things where you can see what each other are doing, even if it's not directly linked immediately to what you're working on and what you're delivering. If you can start seeing the visuals that are being developed or see the other conversations that are happening, that's really helped contextualize things and just make it so much better from the start, rather than having to do like a match pass on that later on to make it make more sense.
Cool. So there's the next question is one that we talked about in advance, and not everybody sort of felt that they had something to say about it, but I want to ask it anyway and sort of see what we get, which is, have you been on a project where you felt that things were starting to kind of go off the rails a little bit, and then it was successfully saved and things worked out well? So are there sort of cases of that you can think of?
I can. For Thirsty Sword Lesbians, I was writing a space-based wrestling. I really like pro wrestling, if you haven't noticed. A space-based wrestling setting. And I got super, super lost in the weeds of like, how do I explain wrestling to people that don't know very much about wrestling, but could be interested in the storytelling parts, to the point where I started writing a glossary, not writing the actual setting, not writing any of the things that like you would need to know to play this, but just like explaining like, this is what a face is, this is what a heel is, this is what a heel turn actually is, and how it's generally understood by the public. And I asked the publisher Evil Hat, like, hey, can I make this a separate document or something? Would I be able to like increase my word count? Is that going to be okay? Because that's not what we discussed at first. And they said, you can, but write the setting first, and then we'll talk about doing that after. And then I just wrote a mechanic that did wrestling without explaining wrestling instead. And it all worked out in the end, that I didn't have to explain it. I gave some resources for people that might want to like look at a couple of minute video or like read an article. But I didn't need to explain wrestling for people to be able to make wrestling happen. And that was definitely the freedom of being able to just say, I can do it later, but I should do the first thing now. Kind of save that whole thing.
Yeah, I don't know if this counts as like going off the rails because it's sort of, I guess a certain part of it is expected, but like on one project I'm on right now, we've had to do a couple of like just big major script rewrites, which always feels in the moment like things that have gone wrong in some way. Like what could I have anticipated something who have not gone this far down the road with the script? But in each case, like it's actually not been that bad. Having the flexibility to go in, kind of tear that up and still use as much of it as possible and make it work in a different way. And that a lot of it came down to just like not being as plugged into, not being able to get hands-on with some of the mechanics early enough, not being able to just sort of really match it closely, and just like partly changing production considerations from what we'd originally talked about to what was actually like coming out in practice with development. So I think part of that is just being flexible and responding to that. But it can be, I mean, particularly if you get to the point where you start polishing something, it can be really gutting to start pulling it apart and then having to go through all that again. But often there's a kind of balance of investment where I think work for hire is good in this way because you come in with I come in generally with less investment in the thing initially, and it's about finding where that is and getting with it. But also that can make it much easier to like, okay, we need to do this differently. Let's take what's cool about this and do it in a different way, and just gutting it and making it work in a different shape.
So speaking of scripts, somebody has asked, you've mentioned deliveries and deliverables a couple of times. What are they? What are you delivering? Is it text? Is it documents, spreadsheets, coding, in-game engines? Are there things you would highlight in particular?
Yes.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it depends a lot, and this is one of the useful things to do when you first start, is to kind of ask them what they're going to need. Sometimes it's just give me an ink file, or like make an outline. Sometimes it's here is our bespoke like browser-based engine. You will have to put the story into it, go learn it. It depends a lot.
Yeah, in some cases where that hasn't been clear, if this has made sense to me in the moment, I've often said for this next thing I'm going to produce X, and I just said like, my expected output for this next section is this. Which particularly for early stage stuff, if you're trying to, if they're not clear on what they want and what the format should be, I'll often just proactively say that so that they know that before I spend time working on it. But then also we can recalibrate if that's not quite right.
Again, tabletop is weird, so mostly it's here is our in-house Word document file, and this is how you're expected to put it out for large companies. For other ones, it might be we need you to generate like a PDF using whatever program of your choice, but also follow this very specific format that we only have one file for, and it's probably in Word. And for indies, it might just be make something that makes sense. We can fix it later when we go to do the layout. We just need you to give us text. So it'll vary wildly.
Yeah, actually, similarly with the nuts and bolts of the stuff I actually hand over. If I always sort of default back to Word and other things where I can be flexible with the template, because that helps me write faster, but often like 90% of games writing ends up being in spreadsheets or something like that. It's often working like in terms of what we're actually handing over. It's like Google Docs, Word documents, Excel sheets, lots of things. Just to usually it's balancing like getting a bunch of words down and fitting some structure that's going to be implemented in a programming context, and therefore not having to have a programmer read that by hand and implement each direction. And figuring it out can be a challenge in the first place if they don't know what the format's like.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience in games and a little bit outside of games as well, this really depends a lot on kind of how advanced the project is overall. So if you're working with a studio that has been established for a long time and they're creating something that is of a format that they're quite used to working with, then they probably either have an in-house tool or they have a specific way that a spreadsheet output or something else is going to plug into that. And so it'll be like, here is the file format that we need this to come in, or something like that. Or like you're going to have Unity on your machine and you're going to be going in there and doing some things. But then there's a whole range of other stuff that can happen. And I've had some projects where I was delivering ink files or I was delivering Twine files. Like you might not realize this, but actually like a non-trivial number of commercial games actually have Twine under the surface, more than you would expect. So there have been things where I've done stuff like that. There have been other things where the deliverable was a design document or feedback on somebody else's design document or really specific instructions about what to do next, or a spreadsheet of dialogue lines with appropriate tagging. So it's quite varied. So we have a question on what is meant by doing quick iterations. Is that writing a short description or storyboards, or if we're, I think this is in the context of like iterating quickly to arrive at a good communication with the client.
For me, it usually just means not polishing something, or being willing to not polish something and just produce some kind of output, whatever it is, whether it's a design document, a discussion document, something that conveys what you're thinking and where you're at with your planning in a way that doesn't involve making the actual thing, which presumably would be more time consuming. So it's trying to shortcut that, and then ideally in some repeatable form where you go, okay, here are the things that didn't work. Let's show that. Let's go away, do that again, and show them again. But it can mean getting the client to understand that it's intentionally not polished and that we shouldn't quibble over specific words or all that kind of thing. Yeah.
A thing I've seen done myself a lot is do exactly one very finished version that like you can probably do pretty quickly. Like essentially, if you were to make a mock-up like magic card version, where it's just one, you can do it really fast, you can change it very quickly, and you won't lose a bunch of time doing that work. That would be like your baseline iteration, and then say, okay, here are the steps that I used to get to that, and here's the other, just like dumping a pile of paperwork on someone's desk. It's like, here are all the other ones, but at step 1 instead of step 5. And now, are there any changes that you need to make?
Yeah, it's quite important that you are comfortable enough doing these fast, because you're probably going to be the person leading this and you want them to understand the format you give it to them in. But if you're like, hey, I'm confident, have this diagram, have this document, give it back to me with your thoughts, I'll give you another one. And
another question is, do you find work for hire more or less fulfilling than the work that you are developing for your personal projects? And there was a follow-up question to that, but I'll start with that bit.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know. More and less. I think. I find it easier to, like I said before, it's like easier to I second guess myself less, and there's a challenge, there's a fun that comes from solving a specific, already defined, constrained, slightly problems which has been there, versus trying to create something from nothing. Which, I mean, work for hire can be that, but I like that. But then, yeah, being able to like own something fully and just put all of yourself into it is also really important.
I think I lean towards a balance. If I do a lot of kind of work for hire, my head might just start saying, hey, but this idea, let's put all of yourself into this idea. This is really core and important to you. And if I'm working on that a lot, sometimes I'm like, but maybe we could switch it up and only focus on writing for a client for a spec. So I like the balance.
For me, it's just differently fulfilling, because the thing that I'm doing for myself is probably the absolute most self-indulgent thing that I can make. It's the 1920s era prohibition, Blades in the Dark hack, where actually you're exploring community and how you give back to it. But doing something for spec, it's like, well, maybe I'll explore some facets of community building within this larger framework of like hack and slash D&D style adventure. Or, well, I want to explore some of like gender and feelings in this wrestling game, but actually it's about gender and feelings. So spec work might let me narrow down on one very particular thing, but stuff that I do for myself will be exactly what I want to see in the world, and maybe only 2 people might play it if I don't force them to play test it for me.
The second half of that question was, have you ever managed to pitch personal projects to big fancy productions or keep part of an IP for work for hire to use it on your own? Do those things ever happen?
I think I'm too new to this to answer that.
Not yet is the answer probably for me.
Yeah, I haven't done that. And I like not yet as an answer. That's more optimistic. Yeah, I haven't got any direct experience with that.
So, I mean, I don't, depending on how you define big fancy productions, I have. I haven't, like, not at the absolute top end of this scale, obviously. Like, there are no AAA games out there that are the result of my individual brainwave. But there are projects where I've been working at a company and we built something that was kind of based on an idea that I had, rather than that being something that came down from elsewhere. That happens, I would say it happens more often when you're not a freelancer, though. It is more likely for that to happen if you're actually an employee of a studio, because the sort of the context for those things to come up is more present there. There are some costs to doing that as well, because if you take something that you're excited about and you make it belong to the studio, then your creative control over that shifts, and it creates the possibility that you lose ownership of it, or that for other reasons it becomes something that wasn't really what you envisioned. So it's not kind of a simple thing, but it can happen. It just like tends typically not to be in the context of freelance work, I would say. Is it mainly linear narratives that people here are writing, or do you also do branching narratives, dialogue trees, etc.? Do you have any experience with making use of storylets and so on?
So I have done a bit of all of these. So a lot of the stuff, there's a lot of stuff I do that has some amount of branching. Now that depends a lot on the project. Sometimes it's just like, at these points you do choose which skill check you do, or choose which dialogue option you do, and they all kind of funnel into the same thing. It depends. I have had one which had sort of storylet, make a decision, outcome, and those would happen based on one very big Excel sheet of, have you met this precondition? Has this happened? What year is it? What position are you in? Here's the storylet. So yeah, it's different projects need different things, and I've come across a couple of different ones.
Yeah, similarly, some things I've worked on or are working on are sort of linear with still interactive elements. So there's stuff like this stuff that could be, I guess it's not linear if it can be experienced out of sequence, but not branching in the truest sense, where there's sort of more division there, more variation. But there's some stuff that's been fairly straightforwardly linear, as much as that happens, and some stuff where, like in personal and commercial projects, where we're using more of a storylet model of something more atomic and rules driven in terms of content flows. But yeah, it's kind of everything.
Again, tabletop is a lot weirder, where everything you write in tabletop is somewhere between a storylet and a more linear narrative, because it has to be able to branch, because you can never predict what will happen at any given table. Like if you see it a lot at conventions. If you ever go to a tabletop convention and just listen in on different tables playing the same adventure, people will like have characters capable of not passing a check to go through a certain door that might fast track them towards like an end goal, and have to go around, but because they go around, they get something else. And like you'll have a bunch of different checks and balances within an adventure to make it so that no matter what, you should be able to get through it, but it'll all be kind of linear because you need to get to like an endpoint of, and now that you've done all this, you've gotten here and you have met like your first big bad evil, or you've met the NPC that will be guiding you in the next part of an adventure, or anything like that. So like somewhere, tabletop is somewhere between the two. I've learned a lot by doing both interactive fiction writing and also like writing more tabletop, to learn how to write better like interactive fiction and then better tabletop. And yeah.
So thanks, Allie, for your answer. I was actually a bit curious, because now personally I've played something like Dungeons and Dragons and then on to Dungeon World, and it seems to me there's a development actually in tabletops as well, in the way that you want to organize the way that the story plays out. So basically there have been some thoughts about placing stuff at specific places. That's the old traditional way, and then it's more like that you actually have a number of events that can happen at different locations. Do you see it the same way, or how do you work with this?
Yeah, that whole idea of play to find out what happens comes from Apocalypse World, where you have an overarching narrative, the way you might have for a game, a traditional video game, where it's these events will occur, should occur in about this order, but the underlying day-to-day happenings are completely different and can branch out wildly to funnel back into something else, into that like in story arc point. That comes from Apocalypse World, which then spawned like Monster Hearts and eventually Blades in the Dark, Dungeon World, a bunch of other games that then have spawned more games. And it's much like a wildly branching narrative with no scope. It just kind of keeps going.
Okay, thank you.
How do you gauge how much work you should be putting in when you have a set amount that you're going to be receiving on your contract, and the work you have to do could be more than what you're getting paid for? Like, to benefit the project, you may need to do more work than warranted while not necessarily overworking yourself in the process. So this is kind of like just coping with the parameters of a fixed budget.
I'm trying to do less fixed budget stuff now if possible, partly because it's basically, I was talking before about estimating being difficult. It's basically impossible to get a good estimate on that. And I think a lot of like when I was reading around on, setting freelancing rates and all that kind of thing, a lot of other industries, particularly like software development, seem to be like fixed rate is the way to go because you can get more profitability out of it. I don't think that it's not tracked with my experience in games, because most of the time when a client has been much more predisposed towards a fixed deliverable based budget, is because of budget constraints and keeping a cap on that, which makes complete sense. But therefore what the other industries are advocating for in terms of, but are you getting more out of that, is you're budgeting much higher than what you realistically expect the time to take, which just isn't an option if the budgets are already compressed. I think it's partly unavoidable. For what I try to do with these projects is just be like super clear about scope in contract, like have a contract, have a statement of work like as a appendix to that contract, be super clear about what's going to be involved, like naming number of revisions, that kind of thing, all these kind of things, so you have something to lean on. That just like, and again, if you can't do that, then that's a sign. If you can't nail those things down at that stage, that's a sign you probably shouldn't be signing up to that kind of thing where you might be saddled with some kind of piece of work where you're doing way more than is reasonable, because not only does that impact that project, it will impact your ability to take on other better paid work if you're getting that at that stage. And then if you stagger it, try and break it down as much as possible to a deliverable. You can use the same contract, you can just add that onto the same way, but like be super specific and like have specific constraints, and where that's not possible, figure out a way of doing so, because that's like one of the diciest scenarios, I think, in terms of what's going to come up.
Yeah, and I've not had a lot of trouble with clients there. If I say I prefer to do things by a day rate and this is my rate, and I will try to do as much as I can in the kind of work that they will get the most out of, but I do try to stay with day rates, because then I know that the work I put in I will be paid for, and we will do the best towards the project, but I have that kind of bottom line.
Once more, tabletop is very weird because it's closer to prose writing rates, where you are paid a fixed like per word sent rate, and that's just how many words you do, and it doesn't usually include like how much research you need to do, like needing to say order food because you have to like do a bunch of other things and also write, and you don't have enough time to cook for yourself, or like anything. If you need like an extension, if you need to like turn something in later, none of that is included in your actual rate because it's usually paid by the word. With indie projects, it'll be like a fixed large, well, not usually large, but a fixed dollar amount. And still it's usually based on a per word amount that they get to that doesn't include research. So something you might run into, like I end up writing a lot of things that have to do with wrestling because people know I already know about wrestling, and thus I don't have to do as much research. But they'll include it in like, we're paying you more per word because we know you know about wrestling and game design, and we're paying you for that experience. But it's hard to do. It would be great if you could charge a rate for tabletop game design, because it is a lot of research and reading and like seeing or watching or playing other games that have nothing to do with what you're actually doing to see what's available to make something for a specific project.
Yeah.
One other thing. Go on, Emily.
Oh no, go for it.
I was going to say one other thing. I've never had this issue manifest, so there have been a few times where it's been a bit, but learned this from friends. If you're doing a milestone or fixed fee deliverable in some form, like put something in your contract that says if the milestone gets cancelled or something changes on their side that like negates that work, you will get paid for all the work you've done up to that point, up to the theory. Like we just have a clause in which is, you know, we set what an equivalent day rate would be, cap it at the actual milestone payment for that rate, and say, hey, if you cancel this, if you change your mind, we will charge you for the time you put into it, because that's kind of another kind of mild nightmare scenario, is like doing all that work and then something changes on their side that contractually they can just say, oh, sorry, we're not doing that anymore, when you've already invested the time.
Yeah. No, I also, like, in most cases recommend a day rate. And if there's a circumstance where, or an hourly rate, depending on sort of what the project size is, but one of those. And if there are circumstances where the client is concerned about their budget, like often there are ways of framing the contract to say, you know, if it looks like we're approaching, you know, cap X, then we'll have a conversation about, you know, whether we need to vary the scope or stuff like that. But that gives you a lot more sort of safety and flexibility on the writing side. If you do absolutely need to agree to a fixed budget, then the trick is to try and start from a position where you feel like you have quite a bit of leeway within the hours that you've budgeted for, because you will use up at least some of it, if not all. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question that we had planned for, and then I'm going to turn off recording because we're coming up to, I promised everybody we would stop at 9 p.m. UK time because it is getting late. So, but that's not to say that people can't ask more questions after that, but I just want to kind of wrap the recorded portion of this. So the last thing that we were going to do as part of the plan was just what surprised you about doing freelance writing or narrative design work?
So we kind of touched upon this earlier, so maybe this will happen to other people as well. But I was surprised for the projects where I've worked on them, and either I couldn't work for the full length of the project, or it was planned to and then I couldn't finish it, or something was canceled. And I knew going into freelance that I would have to kind of let go of the project and be fine with that and move on. And it's really, really hard. Like, you've worked on something, you've come up with, you love these characters that you've made, you're really interested in how the mechanics were going to work out once like it got into the game, and just at some point you have to go, okay, that's not happening. I don't own that. I can't take that for myself and make that game. It might never happen. It has been canceled, so it won't happen. I need to be okay letting that go. And that it's, even knowing that that was going to happen, I was surprised at how hard it was.
For me, it's the sheer amounts of freedom and self-indulgence I've been allowed to just wallow in working on projects, to the point where, like I mentioned before, now I'm specifically asked to do things
How's your
that I have.
potato? How's your sausage?
I've been asked to do a lot of things that I have specific interest in, like wrestling and like just like exploring community dynamics, because that's what I've shown interest in, that's what I have knowledge about, that's what I have to do less research on, and thus it's easier to like figure out a rate to pay me for a thing. But because I've made a name for that, now I get to write more things about wrestling.
Yeah, for me, like, I just find my initial impressions of a project can be way off. Like some things I've been like mildly sniffy about, or I'm like, is this something I'd enjoy? I get into it and I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, this is like stuff I wouldn't, I sort of came close to just dismissing for some reason or other, is a really like valuable thing to do. And the same can be true on the opposite, was something I think I'm going to love actually, like in practice, for whatever reason it turns out to be. So I guess like getting used to being surprised by things.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we're going to stop the recorded and formal portion of this here, but thank you very much for participating in this and sharing your experiences. Okay, and recording.